Yeah, I also like tech. Yeah, great form of debate. All right, just get into it then. So, if y'all have been not been living under the rock, then you should know. If y'all don't live under a rock, then you should know the topic. It's the UK should rejoin the EU. I know a lot of people were mad that it's different from the camp topic, which was about French nuclear sharing, but there's a lot of interesting ground, a lot of interesting arguments that we hope to touch on today. Yeah. So first, we'll just get into some background. Uh, so before we dive into the resolution, we need to know what it means. So the UK is a parliamentary democracy with three distinct jurisdictions: England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. So it's not just England. This is important to know because a lot of people will go for arguments that will deal with these other jurisdictions like Scotland, Ireland, etc. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're debating the topic. Then the EU is obviously really popular, 27 member states, and they all have really strong ties for like things like cooperation in the areas of climate, research, trade, etc. We'll talk more about what they cooperate on and how that can be used for argumentation. And very, very importantly, rejoin means to return to someone or something. There's a lot of interesting people who would read T definitions on you, talking about how, oh, rejoin actually means to respond to someone else's argumentation, or a lot of like nonsense there. But again, 90% of debate is nonsense. So I would recommend you have like maybe something in your back files relating to the legal definition of the word rejoin. Always keep handy to keep. Yeah.
Awesome. So next we're going to talk about the EU, which is important because it's an actor in one of the resolutions, and it's important to understand what all the actors are. So first is the history. The EU officially is called the European Economic Community, and there's a couple major institutions that are going to be important whenever we're talking about specific arguments. First is the European Council, second, the European Parliament, third is the European Commission. These are just three different ways that they actually distribute the legislative capabilities. For example, there's different amount of like members in each sort of institution, and then policy making just goes down the pipeline. So whenever you see a card, for example, cut with like EU Commission or European Council, you know that that's specifically legislative part of the EU. So an important part of this as well is the single market, which I think is going to be a core of a lot of arguments on this topic. Single market is basically one unified market between the all 27 EU countries that allows for the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people, which is going to be foundational to a lot of the arguments that we're going to talk about later. Next, there's policy coordination that also happens. There's a bunch of regulations that the EU has on their member states in areas like trade, agriculture, the environment, and regional development. It's going to be important because we're going to talk about later on when the UK joins, they may have to follow some of these regulations. Finally, there's this thing called the veto power, which means you need unanimity required on certain policy areas, for example, defense and budget, meaning all members actually need to agree on it in the first place. So yeah, that could lead to some interesting arguments in the future.
Great. So now we talked about the EU. Let's look at Brexit. So, contrary to popular belief, Brexit didn't happen in 2016. The referendum for it was. So it was a very, very slim majority. It was like about 52% of people in favor versus 48. So it was really a hotly contested debate. And a lot of the rationale behind why these people wanted to leave the EU because of things like immigration and generally the idea that they wanted more autonomy from the EU's regulation and control. It's important to keep in mind because a lot of the neg arguments will really revolve around these themes because the authors that produce a lot of the neg cards are going to be of this kind of mindset. And okay, so in 2020 of January was when they actually left the EU. And since then, we've seen a gradual process of them like changing the regulations, like really reorienting themselves away from the EU. So we've recently seen like them slashing a lot of climate legislation the EU provided, tons of trade barriers, etc. And we'll go more into this in depth when we get into like more of the AF and neg arguments. Yeah.
Awesome. Next, we're going to talk about the UK-EU relationship now, which is really key, especially as you're looking at the uniqueness picture of things as to what's happening right now. Recently, cooperation has expanded due to the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, which is also a figure you should know. If there's cards talking about Starmer specifically, it's likely referring to new UK policies being put into place. Right now, Starmer is seeking a reset of relations between the UK and the EU. But importantly speaking, the red line for the UK right now is joining the single market or customs union, i.e., their policy as of right now is that they're not going to join, which is a reason why we're debating this topic in the first place. Currently, the efforts are largely small scale, but they are expanding in things like defense policy, trade, and fishing. For example, they reduced regulations on like agricultural trade recently and tariffs in that nature to increase trade between the two. Northern Ireland right now still follows much of EU policy, which could open the ground up to a lot of Ireland arguments I've seen being cut on this topic because they're already following the EU right now. And then finally, the UK has negotiated independent trade deals, for example, the CPTPP, which is a big trade deal in the Indo-Pacific region. I believe it consists of 11 countries. It's a pretty big deal. So as you're going to see later on, the fact that the UK can negotiate independent trade deals is going to be really key, especially for like other stuff on like the net ground.
Yeah. And I guess now we can look into like what the picture of what rejoining would look like. So thankfully, a lot of people, like 57%, favor rejoining now because they've seen things like economic losses and tons of other consequences that have arise from Brexit, and they really want to go back. But the important thing here is even if the people want it, we can see here on the side that like a lot of the political parties in the UK don't want to rejoin. Like a lot of the major ones, like the Conservative Party, Labour, Reform, they all don't want to rejoin the EU, which is opens ground a lot to like a lot of politics disads and stuff you'd see on the neg. So it's pretty important to keep in mind. So now that we've talked about public opinion, we need to really look at what this rejoining would look like. So the EU powers would want the UK back without opt-outs. What that means is that an EU member state has the ability to just like opt out of adopting certain policies or cooperating on certain initiatives on certain like areas. And the EU does not want the UK to do that. So we'd see this, for example, the EU would not allow the UK to opt out of their monetary policy or the euro. So we would reasonably see the UK adopting the euro rather than the pound if they were to rejoin. So that's pretty important to keep in mind. There's probably a lot of arguments talking about euro hedge and stuff like that, but that's more for later.
Awesome. So now we're going to talk about the strategy, especially as you're preparing for upcoming tournaments like UKSO and Yale, probably. So just broadly speaking, evidence on the UK rejoining will be limited, especially in comparison to the evidence that analyzes more of the harms and the benefits of Brexit. So whenever you're looking for evidence, make sure that your evidence on the harms and benefits of Brexit are actually contextual to the current environment of like
How's
trade
it
and
going?
economic
It's going pretty
relations.
good. Are you taking notes? No, they're recording. Take
And
notes.
then,
I don't
yeah,
have time to watch them.
uniqueness will decide rounds. Like, for example, right now, again, we've told you guys that the EU and the UK have been increasing cooperation. So that's a lot of good picture for the neg uniqueness. If something's already doing well, there's no reason to affirm. And uniqueness will decide rounds. So make sure staying up to date with the news, especially a big global issue like this is always changing. The EU and the UK are always passing new policies with each other, especially if your argument is dependent on things like that. I would make sure you're always reading the news on these things. Again, there'll always be multiple versions and links to the same argument. We're going to expand on this a little bit later. But again, what Abby was talking about earlier, there's a lot of common args related to the opt-outs argument, whether or not the UK rejoining will mean that they don't get the opt-outs they did the first time anymore. That's a whole separate debate in and of itself. And finally, the topic definitely is not, was Brexit good or bad? You always have to look at the status quo, especially on like tech teams. Maybe like saying Brexit is good or bad will work on like late judges, but tech teams will definitely look at like the scenarios in context as to what's happening right now. And it's probably an uphill battle for you to win that from there.
Yeah. So we'll jump into the AF arguments here. So the core of the topic is really around the economy and trade, etc. So ever since the UK left, it not only hurt them because they lost out on like important trade with the EU and important cooperation, but the EU also lost a major trading partner. So the issue kind of goes both ways. And affirming would do things like align regulation as they're joining. It would eliminate like cross-border tariffs, prevent like these extra paperwork and regulatory barriers that happen when the UK would leave, and it would really create more alignment. So this is kind of your standard scenario of like, oh, GDP goes up, poverty goes down. And it's really, really good to focus on the uniqueness debate here because there are a lot of authors who may even be saying the UK's economy is doing very, very well. But you want to kind of go for the angle and paint a picture of how the UK's economy is doing now, talk about poverty, talk about homelessness, etc. And that can really guide you in these kind of debates, especially on delay. Now, the second F argument, this is more of a tech one. It's about defense. So you really want to paint a solid uniqueness picture. The Europe cannot defend itself against Russia. NATO is collapsing because Trump has pulled out, etc. And they need like another layer of defense and deterrence. So if the UK were to rejoin, they'd be forced to adopt something called the Mutual Defense Clause. This is very similar to NATO's Article 5, which basically says an attack on one NATO country is attack on all. So basically, if another country in the EU becomes attacked by Russia or etc., the UK would have an obligation to intervene by that mutual defense clause. And that's really important because it shows that there's like another layer of nuclear deterrence because the UK is a nuclear power, but it would also leave way to things like cooperation arguments and talking about how the UK can do things like joint defense spending and other scenario and like drills and other scenarios that they can do with the EU. And this is like your standard Russia war scenario. If a Russia war happened in Europe, it could draw in multiple nuclear powers who have an interest in the region, causing a great power confrontation and extinction from nuclear war. Now, this is one of the really, really good lay AF arguments, climate. It has really clean solvency, and I'll just get into it clear. So the UK, ever since they left the EU, they don't need to adopt or follow a lot of the EU's climate regulations. So we've seen a lot of the far right parties just like throw all that out the window, and we've seen tons of air pollution and environmental health problems in the UK. So if the UK were to join, they would be forced to adopt EU laws on sustainability and have things like carbon emission limits, etc., which would kind of just solve the crisis entirely. That would prevent things like high emissions from like industrial activity and prevent people from dying from like asthma, pollution in general, and a lot of scenarios. There was a really interesting Guardian article that actually did a health study because post Brexit of the UK and found that like over like 30,000 people actually die of air pollution because of Brexit. So it has a lot of really good ground and it's really, really strong on delay. Now, this is kind of a more nuanced version of the economy argument about employment. So, UK citizens, in order to travel to in order to work in other countries in the EU, they need things like visas and work permits, like additional layers, which kind of creates a barrier to entry for a lot of people who want to work and like join the workforce in the EU. But if we were to affirm there's this policy of free movement, as Kai said, a free movement of trade, capital, and people. So this would allow people to just do not need extra work permits and just go to work in EU countries. A way to picture this is like, for example, if I'm living in California and I wanted to go to New York, I wouldn't need to give my passport at the airport. I can just go. It's similar to how the EU would work. So this would lead to like UK citizens being able to work in the EU, like get jobs, etc., which would like reduce poverty. We'd see more economic growth for two nations. And it's a more nuanced take on the economy argument because there's a lot of literature about how, oh, even if the UK were to rejoin the EU and improve trade, it wouldn't actually resolve a lot of the economic problems the UK faces. But this kind of can get around that and say it not only increases trade, it does like has employment benefits, etc., which is a really nuanced take on the economy argument. Finally, there's the Ireland AF, as we talked about, reunification. So Northern Ireland. So Ireland, half of it, the northern part, is part of the UK, and the main part of it, the southern part, is an independent country that has EU membership. So Northern Ireland does not have EU membership. The main Ireland does. So if we were to affirm, it would give Northern Ireland, like by the transitive property, membership into the EU as the UK is part of the EU. That would lead to like more alignment between the two countries. Northern and Southern Ireland would remove things like trade barriers, align legal frameworks, which would make the reunification process easier. So there's a lot of recent news about how like Northern and Southern Ireland are trying to reunify and like doing a gradual approach. Rejoining would make that much easier. And This would lead to like boost in GDP because now the Irish economy is fully integrated. But this is not only like just the general economic like impact, but it's also really has grounds in like structural violence. If you're interested in that like kind of structural violence debate, this is a pretty good way to go because Northern Ireland has faced things like really high poverty, crime rates, etc., because they're at the whim of the UK's like bad policies a lot of the time. So if they were to rejoin and they didn't need to, and the EU could like help them out there, that could like help marginalized communities, etc. So it might be a way to go for that. Yeah, hand it off to Kai.
Awesome, perfect. Just wait, go back to the
Oh yeah.
previous slide. So just like as a brief overview, just before we start talking about specific arguments, just like generally on this topic, there's like almost two categories of arguments like we want you guys to be thinking about. So there's whether affirming will harm or benefit specifically the EU, or whether affirming or negating will harm specifically the UK. And I think you've seen sort of like trends, even as Avi was covering the sort of AF arguments, that there's two sides of the coin there. So whenever you guys are researching, I want you guys to think about those two sides of the coin specifically. But now we can start getting into arguments. Awesome. So the first argument here is the AI market argument. So for the uniqueness, the UK has had a very strong AI market, especially post-Brexit. Right now, they're the third largest in the world and the largest in the EU due to things like lower regulation, which has empirically allowed AI regulation to flourish. I've already cut evidence for this topic saying like specifically UK regulations post-Brexit have allowed things like AI regulatory frameworks to emerge that actually allow for innovation specifically. The link is that under affirming, the UK has to abide by and enforce strict EU regulations under the EU AI Act specifically. So that means the regulations are on that more harmful towards innovation. So these UK companies can't innovate as well. Um, for the internal link, it's just AI projects and startups likely will leave the UK for places with less regulation because they see it as more beneficial. They don't need to go through things like compliance costs or regulatory frameworks as much. There's a bunch of different impacts you can run, both lay and tech ones. You could argue, just general like poverty, jobs impacts, or there's probably evidence out there also saying like the AI market is linchpin to UK's economy, so thereby by removing it leads to a recession, and then you can probably find some extinction scenario out of that. Overall thoughts on the contention, it's probably runnable on both lay and tech. Again, there's the recession spillover argument versus the basic jobs loss. If you're running this on the tech though, I would be a little bit cautious because it's a little bit vulnerable to like AI bad args. Like some teams like could run like S risk, which is basically like AI takes over in the future and enslaves everyone and suffers. But yeah, as you're running against a good tech team, I would keep that in mind. The time frame is also probably pretty decent for this argument because you can argue that investor pullout is likely perceptual in a post-affirmative world, therefore a recession triggers. So on the weighing page, this argument will probably also be good. Awesome. Next onto the econ scenario, just broadly, like a lot of these arguments are going to be a little bit similar and talking about specific regulations and restrictions that will occur once the UK joins the EU, because there's a common theme and a common like general argument on the neg. So for this argument, the uniqueness picture is that Brexit has destroyed the UK economy, but it is recovering. On a lay, I think it's also a good idea to acknowledge the fact that Brexit wasn't perfect. It actually did destroy the UK economy, sort of going for more of a middle ground approach. On attack, you don't necessarily, I think, need to acknowledge that Brexit was on net bad. You can just probably find evidence to say they're recovering. That will probably do you better in a tech round. Link pretty simple. Joining the EU again would shift regulations, which would harm the UK economy through things like compliance costs. You have to go through more paperwork, which costs money because you have to pay people to work more hours. There's evidence, I think someone from our school caught that these regulations would specifically cost, I think, $30 billion or something. There's probably other evidence to say different numbers as well, but just to give you guys an idea of like the scope of this impact. The internal link is that it leads to like the same issues that are caused by like the first recession specifically, and then the impact the economy suffers. This was pretty simple, just any econ impact, poverty, death, recession. Also, you could probably run, yeah, and then UK recession spills over globally, causing resource wars and then nuclear war. Um, I think this is a little bit better in the AI arg in the sense, especially if you're running on the lay, you have a higher scope and magnitude for impact because you're likely affecting more dollars in GDP. Also, if the recession is bigger, it's probably more likely to link into extinction. So your internal link to impact scenario, there's like less opportunity for defense by your opponents in there. But yeah, this is a pretty stock argument. Next is vaccine innovation. Again, very similar link. We've seen this similarly before. Uniqueness picture right now is that the UK independent post Brexit, they've been increasing their vaccine innovation. The speed of vaccine innovation is key and key to global innovation. So for this uniqueness picture, I'm going to assume that you need a couple of different cards. I doubt there's one evidence that specifically says all of these things. So probably find evidence saying UK's vaccine innovation is better post Brexit, speed of vaccine innovation is high, and the UK is specifically key. I know that the UK recently has also joined like EU programs that have funded research, like Horizon Europe program again, which probably increases funding to things like universities, which also helps with vaccine innovation. Link, again, similar thing. Restrictions emerge post-AF. The EU re-entry forces compliance with slower EU medical approval systems. This one is a little bit more nuanced, a little bit specific than I think the general econ argument. And you can definitely argue that their blanket responses maybe on regulations aren't applicable to this sort of EU medical approval systems, or you can probably find some nuanced warranting as to why they're uniquely different. So you probably get out of blanket responses in that way. Internal link, similar to the other stuff, lower vaccine innovation, delays response to engineered pandemics. I think this is pretty intuitive, especially if the UK is key to like global pandemic preparedness. And then impact scenario, pretty predictable. Engineered pandemic spreads unchecked, leading to extinction. Only thing with this argument, I personally, as a debater, don't run pandemics impacts that often because there's a lot of AT pandemics blocks and the time frame is sometimes a little bit sketch on pandemics impacts. But I think this definitely has a good strong link and it has some nuance available at the link level with the things like medical approval systems. Next is a populism argument. So this one is sort of that like authoritarianism shift argument that I think Avi was alluding to a little bit earlier. So the uniqueness for this is that since Brexit, the UK has worked on democratic structures. Starmer, the prime minister, again, has a notable example. He's been prioritizing democracy in his policy, especially most recently. But whenever you affirm, the politicians, what they do is that they use the affirmative as fuel to garner support from voters and ignite populist sentiment against the EU. So basically, they use the Brexit reversal policy as a tool for them to get elected in the upcoming elections. So yeah, and then the internal link is that populism within the UK Parliament and possibly even within other EU countries, because other countries could see like if like Spain or Italy let this happen, for example, they're more likely to vote the populist party or the authoritarian party. The populism will then cause infighting because you'll have democracy on one side and then populism on the other side. They probably can't agree on topics, which could probably find some gridlock impact as well. And then the impact here is just short circuits all of AF ground, probably also leads to the EU fracturing in the long term. I think this argument is very good on the weighing page because it, again, has good short circuits to AF solvency, especially if you're arguing, like, for example, Audie was talking about the defense argument earlier. If you can prove that, like, there's no chance of policy passing, it doesn't matter how much the UK can contribute to actually funding defense if they can't pass the policy for it to work in the first place. Also, you can probably find some delineated timeframe evidence for like the next EU Commission elections, for example, and probably read warrants as to why delineated timeframe is probably better against like AF contentions that may not have as clear delineated timeframe. Awesome. Fifth and last contention is trade. So post Brexit, the UK has established actually 35 new FTAs and 70 new trade agreements is total. Some sources might say a little bit differently because there's a little blurry sometimes as to what's an FTA, what's not an FTA. So they've increased their global presence. The link is that affirming forces UK FTAs to be cut due to EU laws on independent agreements. So basically, how the single market as well works is that insofar as a country is in the single market, they can't actually establish free trade agreements with other countries outside of that single market. They can only establish free trade agreements within, i.e., being in the single market. There's actually good empirical evidence on this. For example, when Poland joined the EU back in 1995, they had to cut off their free trade agreement with Israel. So if you're running this as a more of a lay stock arg, lays will definitely like the empirical evidence that you have on this argument. Internal link, pretty intuitive in my opinion. British FTAs and trade is a global multiplier in key agreements. I think we touched on this earlier. Things like the CPTPP, the DCTS, which is the UK's developing countries trading scheme, which could definitely lead to some more lay impacts later on. And the British India BTA are all big trade agreements that the UK has right now that would presumably not be able to continue in a post-affirmative world. And then for the impacts, there's actually a lot of interesting impacts you could run. There's normal ones like job loss, poverty, etc. With things like the DCTS, you can definitely take a more developing countries oriented approach, which I think will be very receptive on the lay, especially if you can really hone in on that narrative and even lean towards more of that structural violence framework, but obviously present it in a more lay manner, prioritizing these more developing countries. And agreements like the CPTPP as well are, I've seen evidence out there saying it's a multiplier against China, for example, China's hegemonic power and BRI expansion. Moreover, it's a model for other trade agreements. So definitely if you're going for that link, there's a lot of other internal link or impact scenarios you can run those agreements. So I think this argument has very good ground. It's very diverse in terms of the impacts you can run on both the tech and the lay specifically. Awesome.